medieval peasant is neither a ballad hero nor a landowner. He lives on the edge. He works from morning till night, and almost all the harvest goes to the owner. In winter, he freezes in an earthen hut with an earthen floor, heats the furnace with dung, and sleeps next to animals for warmth. He eats sauerkraut, bread with a touch of bark, drinks water from puddles and rivers. Meat only on holidays if they are lucky. Disease is a constant companion, and medicine is herbs passed down from memory. The court is unjust. The woman is a laborer and a commodity in one person. And yet the peasant survives. He hides grains, recognizes edible herbs, knows how to cure a burn without a doctor. He holds the whole world on his back, unnoticed without fame. Today we're going to take a look into his life. No romance, only reality. How a stable smells, how an empty boiler rings, and how those who are not supposed to survive. Edible wild plants, food from under your feet. A peasant is walking along the edge of the forest. Under his feet is still damp ground. Last year's leaves, from which the first nettles are stretching. He cuts them with a knife and throws them into a sack. In the evening, he'll boil it on ashes. No salt, no bread, but his stomach will be full. And that on such days is almost happiness. For peasants in the early Middle Ages, knowledge of edible wild plants was not just useful, it saved them from hunger, especially in the hungry spring, a period when winter supplies were almost exhausted and the new harvest had not yet grown. The peasant knew exactly what to harvest and when. In spring, mushed nettles, mother and stepmother, young snowdrops, wild garlic and sorrel. They threw them into boiling water, cooked the chowder, and added a little rye flour, if there was any left. Sometimes old bones were put in, not for meat, but for the sake of the soup. In summer, berries, blackberries, elderberries, bilberries. Wild roots like parsnips and carrots, wild beans, ragwort, dudnick. Swanberries were dried and ground. They were added to flour in order to bake flatbread, at least resembling bread. It was hungry bread, heavy, dark, but edible. In the fall, acorns, beech nuts, roots. Acorns were soaked in water, changing it several times to remove bitterness and tannins. Then they were pounded in a mortar and steamed. Sometimes they were added to chowder or dried as flour. Some trees also provided food. The bark of linden and birch trees was used to make a decoction. In Northern Europe, even the inner layer of pine bark was used, scraped, dried, and ground. It did not satisfy hunger, but it kept them alive. The peasant distinguished between edible and poisonous things without science, only by memory. It was passed on in families as a secret knowledge. Some herbs had the smell of salvation: mint, wild parsley, St. John's wort. Others were deadly: hemlock, bilberry, nightshade. They were known by sight. Mistakes were made, children died, people went crazy with bleach. But those who lived close to the land learned to tell the difference. Aconite root looks like parsnip, for example, but a true farmer would never confuse the two. Lives were at stake. Chronicles of the 9th or 11th centuries mention cases when peasant families ate only herbs for the rest of the summer. The Irish annals of the 11th century describe a famine during which even bitter grass from the roadsides was sold for the price of a sheep. Gathering wild plants was not considered shameful or pathetic. It was a survival craft, a quiet knowledge that was held not in books, but in hands, nose, eyes. One wrong leaf, and by morning there could be no wife or child, but one faithful one, and the family lived. Drying, smoking, and burying food, the art of survival during the winter months. In the world of the early Middle Ages, where there were no refrigerators and winter was a merciless ordeal, the peasant knew that he could not live through the long cold season without the right way to preserve food. Even in the fall, the hard work began: drying, smoking, burying. All these methods were the only guarantee that the family would not face the winter of starvation. Drying is the oldest and simplest method. Meat, mushrooms, herbs, and even berries were all cut into thin strips and hung under an overhang or in an attic where it was dry and windy. The sun did not always shine warmly, but the air and the light breeze dried the food, depriving it of moisture so that it did not spoil for a long time. Connoisseurs knew that too thick pieces took too long to dry and could become moldy, while thin pieces could become brittle and lose flavor. Sometimes the drying was watched for days so that the food could be put away in time. Smoking is more complicated, almost a craft. The peasant built a weak hearth, allowing the smoke to drift slowly and evenly. Strips of meat or fish were hung over the fire, and it became a smoke shell, a defense against insects and bacteria. The resinous wood used for smoking was oak, pine, or alder, which gave the meat its characteristic flavor and helped preserve it until spring. In some coastal settlements, as archaeological finds in England and Scandinavia show, smoking was used not only for meat but also for fish, which was a vital resource. However, the most unusual way was the practice of burying food in the ground, pits, bogs, or even ovens. The inhabitants of many regions, especially in the north, made deep pits in their yards, lined with clay or straw, where they placed root vegetables, apples, dried meat, and onions. Sometimes food was wrapped in moss or rags to protect it from moisture and decay. Archaeologists have found traces of such buried hoards, the remains of food preserved for centuries in peat bogs and marshes, proving the effectiveness of this method. Peasants did not throw away ashes from the stoves for nothing either. In some villages, they sprinkled it on roots and eggs, creating an additional layer of protection against rotting and insects. It was an ancient invention, almost like the first natural preservative. Each winter was a test of survival. Failure to preserve supplies meant starvation, and sometimes the death of the whole family. Therefore, the work of drying and smoking began long before the first frost. Chronicles and chronicles often mention special smoking days, collective actions of the community, when all neighbors gathered to help each other prepare supplies. For the peasant, food was more than nourishment. It was life, hope, and security in the harsh conditions of the early Middle Ages. Every properly preserved apple, every strip of smoked meat could be the difference between a cold death and the welcoming of spring. The simplest hut, heat from nothing, how peasants fought the cold. In the early Middle Ages, a peasant lived in a simple hut, a wooden hut with earthen walls insulated with moss and straw. This construction was not accidental. It was carefully built to protect against harsh winters and penetrating winds. The clay retained heat, while the straw and moss created a natural insulator, preventing the penetration of cold and moisture. Archaeological excavations of settlements in northern Europe confirm that earthen walls with layers of moss and straw were a common solution. The hut often stood low to the ground or even partially burrowed into it, so the ground became a natural shield from the cold. The roof was covered with dense thatch, which was used as a natural insulator and water-repellent material. Without glass, the windows had wooden shutters or the openings were covered with skins, sometimes badly worn, to prevent drafts. Animals, goats, sheep, chickens, not only provided food, but also served as an additional source of heat. Under the same roof with pets, it became warmer. Their breath and body heat warmed the air inside. In winter frosts, when the temperature dropped below 20 degrees Celsius, such a neighborhood with animals was a necessity for survival. In the center of the hut, there was a hearth, a fire without a chimney, which warmed the room but filled the space with smoke. Since there was a lot of smoke, peasants tried not to stay near the fire for too long to avoid suffocation, and slept on straw bunks away from the hearth. The ability to conserve fuel and keep the fire burning was of great importance. In the forests of the Middle Ages, firewood was worth its weight in gold, so branches, wood chips, and even dry grass were used. Every night, a struggle for warmth and safety in the hut, where the minus temperature outside the window could become deadly. This kind of life, without fireplaces and glass, with mud walls and pets around, reflected the harsh realities of the early Middle Ages. The ability to keep warm in such conditions was one of the main factors of survival for a simple peasant. Cold water is an enemy, but also a healer. In the early Middle Ages, the peasant rarely had the opportunity to wash regularly. Baths were virtually non-existent, and soap was a rare and expensive commodity available to only a few. Water for washing was taken from wells, rivers, or puddles, and was most often ice cold, especially in the colder months. Despite its harshness, cold water served several vital functions. We had to wash ourselves in ice-cold water, immersing ourselves to cleanse the body of dirt and parasites. It was painful and hard, but it was the kind of procedure that strengthened the body and spirit. Healers and peasants believed that cold water helped to harden the body, improve circulation, and reduce the risk of disease. Chronicles and medical treatises of the time mentioned that cold water helped reduce inflammation and cool fever. Cold water was of particular importance in the treatment of wounds. The peasant often suffered from injuries, whether cuts, abrasions, or wounds from military conflicts or work in the fields. Without modern medicines and antiseptics, such wounds could fester and lead to deadly infections. Therefore, dipping wounds in cold running water was considered an essential first aid treatment. This method reduced inflammation, prevented festering, and slowed the development of gangrene, saving lives on more than one occasion. Hygiene was a serious problem. The constant presence of lice and other parasites led to skin diseases and general exhaustion. Washing and changing clothes was rare because fabrics were expensive and the manufacturing process complicated. To control parasites, peasants resorted to such methods as cutting hair, using herbal decoctions, e.g. wormwood or St. John's wort, which were applied to the scalp and clothing. These folk remedies had insecticidal and antimicrobial properties that alleviated suffering. Chronicles and chronicles of the 113 centuries repeatedly note that epidemics of pediculosis and skin infections were common in medieval villages. Nevertheless, peasants, despite the lack of modern sanitary conditions, remained healthy and able to work thanks to age-old knowledge and tricks related to the use of cold water. Thus, cold water was both a cruel test and a life-saving healer. The peasant learned to use its power to survive in the harsh conditions of the Middle Ages. Secret supplies in the house. In the harsh world of the early Middle Ages, the peasant constantly felt the burden of taxes and duties. The landlord and royal collectors were not sparing. Grain, vegetables, and even livestock could be taken away at any moment. In order not to be left without means of subsistence, skillful peasants secretly hid part of the harvest, turning the house into a kind of storehouse and fortress. Grain and savings were hidden everywhere, under wooden floors, in earthen walls, in deep pits carefully concealed by piles of dung or straw. Manure served not only as fertilizer, but also as a safe hiding place. Its smell and appearance deterred outsiders and hid the storages from the eyes of soldiers and collectors. Sometimes even the stove was used to conceal supplies. The internal cavities and voids in the masonry were an excellent hiding place for dried roots, beans, and grain. To avoid spoilage and rodent attacks, grain was treated in a special way. It was covered with ash, clay, or placed in vessels made of fired clay, which were hermetically sealed. The chronicles of the 12th century mention that peasants invented clever traps in secret niches in barns, thin wooden panels that could only be opened from the inside. From time to time, the owners checked the supplies, disguising them and moving them around so that even the most experienced prop master would not guess the hiding place. A house in such conditions became at once a living space, a defensive fortification, and a secret warehouse where life was kept. Hidden reserves are not just a stockpile of food. It is hope, fear, and experience, learned over generations, a way to keep a family together in times of famine, invasion, and war. Rapid adaptation skills, being like a beast. During the early Middle Ages, the peasant lived under harsh conditions. Land belonged to feudal lords, and forests were mostly guarded, and only the nobility were allowed to hunt there. However, hunger, war, and harsh winters did not recognize prohibitions, and peasants had to adapt quickly, using natural instincts and cunning like wild animals. Hunting, though forbidden, was the most important means of subsistence. To avoid being seen by the guards, the peasant made the simplest traps from twigs, ropes, and reeds. Primitive nets for fish, loops and snares for small animals. These devices were the result of centuries of experience, handed down from generation to generation without written instructions, all by feel, memory, and observation of nature. To remain unarmed in the forest meant using whatever was at hand. A strong stick turned into a club, stones were thrown with precision, and the simplest traps were the only means of catching an animal. The peasants' hunting skills were akin to animal instinct, quick reaction, patience, and knowledge of the animal's habits. Chronicles and annals mention cases when peasants organized ambushes, luring game to prearranged traps or snares. skillfully avoiding persecution by noble hunters. Historical evidence confirms that the ability to move stealthily and hide in the forest was part of survival. Even if the prey was modest, a few hares or fish, it could save a family from starvation in winter, when fieldwork stopped and food became scarce. Such animal survival was a necessary skill for a peasant who lived on the edge of poverty and constantly struggled with hunger, disease, and war. It was not just hunting. It was a struggle for life that made man a part of nature. An animal adapted to the harshest conditions. Survive tax, epidemic, and raid. In the early Middle Ages, the peasant lived in a constant state of tension, with dangers on every side, from taxes, epidemics, and surprise attacks. Each year brought new challenges, and the ability to survive meant not only working the land, but also cunning, hiding, and even pretending. When a census or tax collection was imminent, the peasant became a master of disguise. He could pretend to be dead to avoid conscription or exorbitant taxation. In some parts of Europe, it was common for entire families to fake their deaths or hide in the forest for months or even years. Chronicle records from the 11th through 13th centuries show that such practices were not uncommon and often saved from imprisonment, confiscation, and the death penalty. Epidemics of plague and other diseases brought not only suffering, but also cruel social consequences. In the absence of modern medicine, peasants used folk methods, isolating the sick in separate corners of the hut, smoking, or applying herbs. Often the dying were hidden in order to avoid panic and not to incur the censure of neighbors, because the fear of contagion was enormous. In such conditions, every home became an outpost of survival, where simple hygiene, cold water, a change of clothes, could save from deadly lice and disease. When smoke appeared on the horizon, a sign of an enemy raid, the peasants mobilized instantly. Wives hid their children in the woods or under the floorboards. Men took their weapons, pitchforks, scythes, wooden clubs, and prepared for defense. Shelters in forests, swamps, or fortified monasteries were often the salvation. Historical chronicles describe how local communities ambushed enemy convoys, hoping to hold off the enemy at least temporarily to protect those left behind. Understanding that property is temporary and life is priceless, the peasant had to sacrifice crops and things just to survive and preserve his family. In such conditions, a special mentality was formed: to live cunningly, to make quick decisions, to be able to run away and start again from scratch. Traditional medicine, treatment without doctors. In the early Middle Ages, the peasant was almost entirely dependent on folk medicine. Professional doctors were rare, and the way to them was often closed due to distance, poverty, and social status. This is why the ability to treat wounds and illnesses became essential for survival. In the arsenal of the peasant, there were improvised means available directly in nature. Ash from the fire. It was used to treat wounds to stop bleeding and prevent infection. Chronicles of the time mention that ash had the property of drying and disinfecting the skin, although the procedure itself was painful. Dung, a thing that is now abhorrent, was then used as a kind of compress for boils and festering wounds, believing that it accelerated cleansing and healing. Onions and garlic were considered not only food but also medicine. Their pungent odor and taste were attributed to their ability to drive away evil spirits of disease and help with colds, fevers, and coughs. There is evidence that in many European villages, garlic was even hung on the door to protect the house from plague and spoilage. Bloodletting was a widespread yet risky procedure. Based on the idea of balancing bodily juices, it was practiced universally by peasants and monks alike. Small incisions on a vein allowed bad blood to be released to relieve fever or pain. Extant manuscripts from the 11th century describe the methods of bloodletting and the instruments used, blades made of stone or metal. But this method often led to complications, and this is where knowledge of dosage and timing was crucial. Women in the villages played a key role as healers. Sometimes they were the keepers of herbs and recipes, because it was women who cared for children and the old. This knowledge was passed on in secret because the church suspected folk healers of witchcraft. But it was thanks to them that many families were saved from disease, famine, and epidemics. They used herbal decoctions, moss poultices, and prayers, combining magic and practical wisdom. Thus, folk medicine was not just a set of random methods, but a real art of survival, which absorbed the deepest understanding of nature, the human body, and the world around. Everything that could afford a medieval peasant in conditions of constant danger and need. Psychology of survival: faith, fear, stubbornness. During the early Middle Ages, the peasant lived in a constant tension between fear and hope. Prayer was not just a spiritual ritual, but a real survival strategy. Words addressed to the saints and the Virgin Mary served not only as requests for protection, but also gave inner strength to cope with daily hardships: disease, hunger, war. Everyone in the rural community knew that no lock would protect the house without the priest's blessing and prayers. Chronicles of that time often tell how peasants gathered for common prayer services, asking for health and harvest, strengthening the bond among themselves and feeling supported from above. Fear was a constant companion: fear of epidemics, wild animals, raiders. To keep his sanity, the peasant relied on superstitions and symbols passed down from generation to generation. Amulets made of iron, crosses made of wood, horseshoes over the door. All this was considered protection from evil spirits and the evil eye. Notions of purity and impurity shaped the prohibitions on which not only spiritual, but also physical health depended. People believed that certain words, gestures, or rituals could change the course of events, and this sometimes became more important than any knowledge. Stubbornness, an almost beastly sense of instinct, made the peasant cling to life at any cost. When neighbors died, when the village suffered from famine and plague, it was this inner resistance that made it possible to rise up and continue the struggle. In chronicles and folk songs, there are stories of people who did not give up because they could not let the memory of their ancestors disappear with them. They went to the field, sowed bread, taught their children to speak and pray, even though death seemed close and inevitable. The psychology of survival of those times is a complex and contradictory fusion. Belief in the invisible, primitive rituals, living fear, and iron will. Without this combination, the peasant of the Middle Ages simply could not have survived in a world where every morning was a test and every night a mystery. A journey into the world of a medieval peasant reveals to us not only the harsh realities of that era, but also the incredible strength of the human spirit. Faith, ingenuity, habits, and simple but vital skills, all these help to survive in conditions that today seem almost impossible. Understanding these historical secrets is not just a glimpse into the past, but a lesson in resilience and adaptation that is still relevant today. If you are interested in deep historical reconstructions and stories about the lives of our ancestors, subscribe to our channel. There are more exciting time travels ahead that will help you look at history from a new perspective and learn how people lived, fought, and survived in the most difficult eras.